Yeah, no problem.
I think you with some.
Ready?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. As Patricia said, my name is Wissam Almonthiri. I'm the president of the MIT Club of Great Britain. My topic is going to be a very violent segue or change from Henry's. So we're going to move from a really great Tai Chi session to a little bit of a talk on an area that's my background and experience, which is the topic of global energy, the global energy mix, and where it was, where it's at now, and where it's going. So, very, very large topic. I'm going to try to do about 15, 20 minutes of talking um, and cover things at a very high level based on the time, and then try to leave 15 minutes for discussion. And I know some of you will be experts on this topic, others not know anything at all, and a lot of people in between. So I've tried to pitch it at a relative layman level, and then hopefully we'll get some questions at the end. So just to start, and hopefully you can see my slides moving, just a second on me. So as I said, I'm currently the president of the Club of Great Britain. I did my MBA at Sloan, actually did the executive MBA program. And while at Sloan, and I continue to be connected to some of the energy initiatives that come out of MIT and Sloan, including the Energy Club there and the MIT Energy Initiative, which some of you will know about. Professionally, I spent most of my career at a large integrated energy company that many of you will know, BP. I lived around the world and really graduated from engineering all the way through to general management and country leadership. But I also spent a little bit of my time working on something that BP produced annually, which is called the Statistical Review of World Energy and the Energy Outlook, which is a kind of comprehensive industry led effort that involves numerous universities and research institutions to kind of produce a stock of where the energy mix is at and where forecasts on where it's going. So a lot of what I'm talking about today will come out of that experience. After BP, I've done a number of things and currently work at a UK listed oil and gas energy company for focusing on emerging markets called Tullow PLC. So here's what I'd like to start. Many of you will have seen this plot. This is a plot of global energy consumption historically. You'll see here that the kind of first really very obvious thing is how closely the growth in energy consumption in the world has tracked to global population increases, certainly until the year 2000. And you can see here that particularly since 1995, we've had huge growth. Actually, since 1950, a lot of growth, exponential growth in energy consumption on the planet, and we'll get into a little bit of what's behind that there. There's been a number of things that have done that. The Industrial Revolution is really fueled demand, and you could see growing GDPs all over the world, lifting lots and lots of people out of poverty. And that's really what you can see here on the graph formed the nations of today, the sort of what we consider to be the developed nations of today, is that significant reduction in poverty, people living under $1 a day over the last 200 years. And much of that was, of course, driven by both the appetite for and the supply of energy to those economies. And GDP growth tracks that pretty closely. Another thing worth looking at is per capita consumption, and also probably no secret, but the world per person consumes a lot more energy than it used to. There's a few dips. Certainly the world wars are notable dips in energy consumption per person. But then, as you can see, really starting in the late the kind of 1940s, just an unprecedented exponential growth in how much energy we consume per person. And really efficiency and the flattening of that per capita energy consumption has only come in the last 20 to 25 years, where some of the efficiency measures that allow us to use less energy or need less energy per day, or get more energy per unit available. All of those have come about in the last 20 years, and we'll talk a little bit about those as well. One last thing on this, and also probably no secret, but this plot here shows you how much per capita energy use is dominated by developed economies. Many of you will have heard the statistic that people in the US use 10 times more energy than someone in India. That number's changed a little bit from the 10x, but the sort of the disproportion between those two sides of the spectrum in OECD countries, developed nations, and developing nations is really one of the most amazing statistics, and has created both the opportunity in the growth of those economies, but also the challenge in things like the climate crisis, which we're dealing with, and we're going to talk about here in a second. So next slide. This starts to get into so we've looked at total energy consumption. We've looked at how it breaks down in terms of per capita use and countries. But now let's look at sources. And the first thing, this is a graph, of course, of how the per capita energy use has been satisfied by different sources of energy. You'll see that from the 1850s till today, and again, no secret, fossil fuels have dominated our consumption of energy, and they've supplied that growth, particularly in Europe, the US, North America. All of that growth and economic development has been fueled by fossil fuels. One kind of lesser known fact, or maybe surprise some of you a little bit, is the 1900s were very much the century of coal. Coal was by far the dominant energy source up until the late 1970s, or maybe the early 1970s. Many countries still rely on coal as their number one energy source in terms of total use, China being one of them, and that's the world's fastest growing economy if you take a 15-year view, of course. And that's a real factor to grapple with as we look forward. Oil and gas have really taken off in the last half century, the last 50 years. And renewables really didn't exist as an energy source up until the 1970s, where the advent of hydro technology came in, and hydro became the renewable source of energy. Renewable energy made up about 1% of energy consumption, and then only really in recent years, the last 2 decades, with the expansion in solar that many of you will be aware of, and the slightly smaller but also relevant increase in wind supply, renewables got to about 2% by 2010 and are somewhere in the range of about 5 to 6% now of total energy demand satisfied through renewable energy. Another interesting way to look at this, what's kind of happened during the course of this growth, and a real simple conclusion you can see here is very much the original industrial revolutions of the world, especially in the developing world, were fueled by coal. Big factories, big manufacturing, all of that was very much fueled by the existence of coal, and that carried well into the 1900s, as we talked about. Then transportation came in, first with cars, of course, and then ultimately to airplanes and everything in between. And that very much made oil the fuel of choice and allowed it to take over as the leader, as I said, in the latter part of the century. Then the world we live in today, whatever you want to put in that bucket of new industry with the internet and the microchip world we live in, and big data and the cloud, much of that is fueled by electricity. And electricity today is predominantly, or a large part of electricity is growing into the world where natural gas is the primary driver, primary fuel for electricity, and trailing behind are nuclear and renewables, which we'll look at a little bit more closely. Next is let's look at the history with regard to the geographical spread. You could see here that US, Europe, and the former Soviet Union really had a big chunk of global energy demand and consumption years before 1980, but certainly into 1980 and into 2010. You could also see that start to decline quite significantly. I mean, the decline in former Soviet Union countries' energy consumption is really stark. Europe is starting in 2010, and you can see already also declining quite significantly if you take oil and gas, which are the largest consumption based, and again, drivers of their growth. And then the US is just starting to decline its energy consumption, a lot of that driven by efficiency more than anything else. Another interesting thing is to look at, of course, we looked at GDP growth and the link to energy. But another interesting thing to look at is the concept of social progress. Some of you will be aware of the Social Progress Index, which many countries are actually advocating replacing GDP with some measure of social progress as the way to define growth. You can look up the definition of social progress, but effectively looks at well beyond just economic growth in the country. And if you take a 2010 snapshot and you sort of correlate it against access to energy per capita, it's quite an interesting correlation you see as well there, where contrary to a lot of belief, you see that social progress seems to also have a good correlation or a good linkage to access to energy, suggesting that many economies are able to take that energy and convert it to betterment for their people and for their populations as well, not just economic growth. So next, let's sort of segue on to forecasts and just kind of look at almost the same trends that we looked at before, but more forward-looking. This, first of all, is a look at overall energy consumption of the world, these two graphs, and the one on the top kind of splits it a little bit more, or both of them split it more by source of energy. First conclusion you can make from these two graphs is the rate of increase of overall energy consumption in the world will decrease. And that's very much driven by efficiency. Anyone who drives a car now or used to drive a car knows that the consumption, the fuel efficiency, the gasoline efficiency of cars has improved at least 100-fold in the last 50 years, and even more so if you look beyond that. You take other things like airplanes, and it's almost, you take 70% less aviation fuel to fly the same size of airplane today. There's lots in the growth of and efficiency of turbines and oil and fuel driving mechanisms that have made us need a lot more energy per unit than before, even if we're consuming roughly the same amount of energy. So you could see that start to show up in the forecast as a major thing for the reduction in the rate of increase of energy consumption in the world in the 50 years to come. What's also really ever present, and in some plots more so than this one, is the growth, the forecast growth in renewables. Renewables will dominate the next millennium. Today, they represent somewhere around 5 to 6% of energy consumption. They are certainly likely to grow to at least 10 to 15% by 2040. And there's also forecasts that see renewable energy growing to upwards towards the highest forecasts I've seen, up to 40% by 2040, 40% of total energy consumption on the planet, which would be a remarkable increase unseen in the history of man. But of course, will have if it does pan out, will have significant benefits to the planet. Fossil fuels in any forecast, though, I think is kind of the other point that's notable here. In any forecast, be it you believe renewables get to 12% or get to 40%, fossil fuels will unfortunately continue to make up a large part of the energy mix. And there will be a rotation within that, and we won't have time to get into the implications of that rotation too much, but natural gas will overtake oil as the leader. It's a cleaner fuel. It will take over from oil, and coal will start to decline quite significantly and already has on a year-on-year basis in terms of growth. Turning the attention to renewables, though, there's a lot of great things about renewables, but to really have them get to anywhere near that 30 to 40% of overall energy demand satisfied through them, there's an enormous amount of investment needed. And some of the areas, and we could do at least an hour on this last bullet point here, it'll help to look at things from a sector perspective. This is a snapshot of today, where energy is consumed at a very high level between industrial, factories and plants, transportation, residential and commercial. And to really get renewables to take over sufficient market share, a few things have to happen. The world has to strongly shift its use of petroleum products, so diesel, gasoline, and the like for transportation. Jet fuel to more electric-based systems, and we hear a lot these days about the growth of electrical vehicles. That, of course, only starts to scratch the surface. Electrical vehicles, of course, today make up less than 1% of total vehicles in the world, and that's only a sort of car transportation that doesn't start to touch all the other modes of transportation. Of course, even if you get there with that, you have to convert industrial use of fossil fuels to renewables. All the grids on all the countries in the world have to convert from being fossil fuel based, which many are today. Many have completed the conversion from coal to oil and over to natural gas. That conversion to cleaner forms of energy to then drive home use, transportation use, and industrial use is going to be significant. And then batteries. Batteries in many ways are the savior, but as some of you probably know, battery technology has its flaws. Currently, the carbon footprint of battery production, including mining, is quite significant, really, really big. The cost of it is also tangible. Batteries are not cheap. And the same goes with renewable energy usage itself. So the cost of solar energy, for example, has come down a significant amount over the last 50 years or the last 30 years. But still, when you look overall compared to alternatives purely on a cost perspective, and certainly in other countries in the world outside of Western Europe in particular, it is the more expensive alternative for a world coming out of poverty, where the cheapest forms of energy are likely to be most attractive. So just here, getting towards the end, if you look at the geographical spread, started to talk about it before, but Asia will dominate the growth picture. There's 4 billion people today out of the 7 billion on Earth, moving from being what the World Bank classes as poor towards middle class, living on $50 a day, and they will need energy. And unfortunately, fossil fuels, for the reasons I mentioned before, will be their most likely first port of call. There's another interesting point here about some other parts of the world. So you see US, Europe, and also African consumption will start to flatten and begin to decline. That's all about efficiency, and in Europe in particular about population. Population decreases. And finally, global collaboration, an obvious statement here, is increasing, but was really necessary to help that rotation away from fossil fuels. Quite a mammoth task to replacing that with more and more renewable clean energy. So just in conclusion, a few things that you could take away if you heard nothing from this last 20 minutes. First, global energy consumption is going to continue to grow, but at the pace of growth is going to decrease over the next 40 years. Energy availability will need to grow to meet that demand as it has over the last 200 years. The question is just how. Currently non-developed nations or developing nations will dominate taking up that growth. And that's very much all about reductions in poverty and social welfare increases. Population is actually going to be less impactful as far as a direct correlation for the next 50 years. Fossil fuels are going to remain with us for the next 40 years. It's just a question of how much will they remain with us. And that's all a factor of how much renewable technology and cost will improve. So, you know, a couple of key takeaways is, given that it's with us, we shouldn't diminish the importance of making fossil fuel use, A, more efficient, and B, more green. Simple stat, and I could throw, you know, a few more at you, but a 20% reduction in emissions from the fossil fuel industry equals about 100x growth in the EV industry. And you know, you could see that both are really important, and certainly growth of renewables through electrical vehicles is critical, but reducing the footprint that is provided to us by an industry that will remain around is a really important endeavor as well. Finally, renewables will require a lot of investment in innovation. They'll require a lot of global policy to change behaviors and preferences and costs. And there will be a lot of collaboration required to shift the world energy consumption growth towards a greener future. And I think with that, I will end there and see if anyone has any questions.
Wissam, may I ask a question?
Of course.
Is it your consensus of experts in the energy sector that we have passed peak oil or not yet?
So the general consensus is that we're not there yet, but we're very close to it. So, and peak oil being more of a demand-based peak rather than a supply-based peak, which is what, if you rewind back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, experts were predicting. So you have different estimates. You see numbers in around the 2030 to 2040 range being peak oil. I've seen that there are people who believe that that's closer to 2060. But the key thing is the consensus now is that will be demand driven, not supply driven.
Okay, Wissam?
Yes, Claude.
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. Is it possible you could make your slides available to us?
Yeah, absolutely, I can. It's all public information I use, so there's no problem at all. I'll get with Patricia and figure out how to do that.
I'm a member of MACA, MIT Alumni for Climate Action. I've posted our website. I'd love to have you join us. Europe is fairly rapidly switching over to a hydrogen economy. There are numerous places where a fuel other than electrification is ideal. One is long distance transportation, maritime shipping, long haul trucking. Second is in home and commercial office building heating, where they're currently using oil or gas, especially gas, because initially they can increase the, they can mix hydrogen with natural gas without having to change the piping up to almost 70%. Above, I think 40%, they have to make some changes in the equipment for burning it, you know, in the furnaces, but even that's not that big a deal. Saudi Arabia is switching to, or looking forward to being the world leader in hydrogen production based on their very low price of energy from wind and solar. So I just like your comments and your thoughts about the hydrogen / ammonia economy and where that fits in here in the US.
Yeah, no, thanks, Claude. Thanks for your comments. I think hydrogen is a wild card that is growing significantly in its use case. And you mentioned a couple of economies there that have said we're going to make this a real test ground and invest heavily. I think hydrogen could really be a game changer. I personally believe that that it has actually a more exponential growth promise than some of the other renewable energy sources, such as solar, for lots of reasons around lack of intermittency, etc. I think in the US, there hasn't been enough done in this space. MIT is doing a lot of work on hydrogen, actually, but as a country and given the criticality of energy security, I think there, in my opinion, and from what we've seen, there hasn't been enough done in the US to give hydrogen an opportunity to take market share and grow as a potential fuel of choice. So I think in the coming kind of half decade, I'll be looking closely to see how that evolves and whether use cases in other countries start to, and particularly China, which is also investing in the hydrogen space, drive the US towards an interest in putting more time, effort, and investment in making hydrogen a potential alternative. Maybe, Patricia, time for one more, if anyone's got anything.
Yes, so Elaine asked, base load electric is one significant challenge for renewables. Massive battery banks and pumping excess water uphill aside, is nuclear such as Bill Gates design a realistic option?
I think nuclear is. I think nuclear, of course, is reduced in terms of its share. I think there's big believers in the potential for nuclear energy. Of course, Bill Gates being a prominent name, that is one. There's two big things with nuclear. I think the two big concerns are, number one, cost. So there hasn't been a new nuclear facility built certainly in the developed world in a very long time. I think the last really large one was built in the late 1980s. You are talking about, at least these days, a sort of $10 to $15 billion initial capital investment to build a nuclear plant. A lot of size and space. And then secondly, of course, security, safety, with the prominent accidents that have occurred, not most recently in Japan, of course. So I think I'm personally less bullish. I don't proclaim to be a better predictor than Bill Gates is on nuclear. I think it's a realistic option in the portfolio of energy options, alternative options to fossil fuels. But in my view, based on what I've seen in my work, is that the growth of nuclear will likely be outpaced by certainly solar and wind, but also energy sources like hydrogen, as we just talked about.
Thank you so much for this informative talk.
No problem. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Um,